are coming in a little bit late. If they have issues, can I just forward them to you?
Yep. Go ahead.
Gotcha.
It started.
Thank you very much. Um, Welcome everybody to the 23rd New Mexico Data Users Conference. My name is Suzan Reagan. I work here at UNM Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and I've been here for about 8.5 years. And if you're counting, this is the 9th Data Users Conference I've put on, and the second virtual one that we've done. So I want to, when I was thinking about putting this conference on this year, and all that we've been through and what is going on with the decennial census, it's an exciting time as a data user, and we put together a really good schedule for you guys. So let's see if I can, for some reason, there we go. A little bit of housekeeping before we jump into everything. If you have questions or anything, we are monitoring chat, and we'll go ahead and put your questions in chat. You can also raise your hand, and we'll try to proctor that with our different speakers. We'll try to keep you, I mean, if we hear noise or something, we'll mute you, but we appreciate it if you go ahead and just mute yourself while we're presenting. But please do feel free to raise your hand and unmute to ask questions. And then just another thing, at the end of the conference, I'll probably send everybody out a link to our conference survey so you can tell us how we did. So real first, I'm going to cover, because there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. Redistricting is up and running right now, or the fourth phase, and Tom Morton will cover more on the phases of redistricting, is in review. But I wanted to do a little bit of, how did New Mexico do with 2020 census and the data that's coming out. Ryaneustis is going to talk to you if he's around. If not, I will cover the State Data Center program, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Center for Census Information Groups of People. And then finally, I mentioned we'll have Tom Morton. So this year and last year, we have been impacted by a pandemic, and I just wanted to take a moment to note that in New Mexico, as of today, as posted by Department of Health, 5,310 people have lost their lives to COVID. And that is a pretty dramatic number for us. And it just, it kind of, lots of people have been impacted and know somebody who has either died or has been very sick and been negatively impacted by COVID. And it just take a moment to think about those. But also, our hearts reach out to their families and friends that are having to go and deal with these issues. And in our own spotlight at Beaver, we lost somebody who was near and dear to us. Jeffrey Mitchell passed this past summer. And I just wanted to know if you hadn't known or heard about that, but it certainly has. He leaves a body of work behind him that covered a ton of information, economic, and how the state of New Mexico does, and his insight of taking lots of data and narrowing it down and visualizing it and communicating it to New Mexicans, to the legislatures, to researchers, was invaluable, and he certainly will be missed by our community. So turning from the sad stuff, let's talk about what has gone on and what has gone right within New Mexico. The apportionment data from the 2020 census was released in April this past year. And in New Mexico, it wasn't really such an important data release because we were not in line to lose or gain a seat in the House of Representatives. But there certainly were neighbors. Colorado gained a seat, Texas gained 2 seats. In the mountain region, Montana gained a seat, or Montana gained 2 seats. Oregon gained, California lost, and a lot of the northern Midwestern states lost seats. North Carolina gained, and Florida gained seats. So that's what the new map looks like. But for us in New Mexico, we were probably more interested in, like, what was our population growth? And I'll just note that over 2010, New Mexico gained 58,000 people in population, but that only actually represented a growth rate of 2.8%. And for comparison, in 2000 to 2010, we grew at 13.2%. So the growth in New Mexico dramatically slowed in the last decade. Not all of the state gained evenly. And you can see within these two slides, the one in the yellows and browns show the raw number of people. And you can see places like Hidalgo, Catron, Tabaca, Guadalupe, Mora, Harding, and Union have very few people, where our population centers continue to be Bernalillo, Sandoval, Santa Fe, San Juan, and Doña Ana County. But if you look at those slide in blue, you'll see that they grew at different rates. Bernalillo only added 2.1% growth, whereas Doña Ana added 4.9%, but San Juan County lost 6.4%. A big winner there is Sandoval at 13.3%. Santa Fe County at 7.4%, Taos had 4.7%, but the really big story was the growth in population down in Leonetti County at 15% and above. So that really kind of tells the story of our gains and our losses here. When I pulled down the redistricting data, which you get down to the block level, we looked at the race and ethnicity that comes out with that data. And here's a real kind of fun looking visualization of where people live. So one dot equals one person, and then we split them out by white alone are the blue dots. Fun and interesting is white Hispanic are your orange dots. And in New Mexico, a lot of people who identify Hispanic don't identify as any other race, so they'll pick some other race. And so you can see in those orange, the sort of clusters of orange dots, you'll also see clusters of purple dots of some other race. And so that's kind of a unique characteristic of New Mexico's population. And I want to note on this slide, we actually increased the size of the minority dots so that they would stand out a little bit. So it is a little bit showing that that kind of makes it overstating the minorities, but we did that so you could actually see where the tribal areas are, and it really dramatically shows you where the tribal areas exist in New Mexico, and so that was kind of a fun thing. So that is our redistricting data. Bieber has a website. We have a page on our website for 2020 data. We've updated our spreadsheet that show each of the decennial census and the population growth from 1910 through 2020 for all states. For New Mexico, 1900 through 2020 by county for population. And then for incorporated cities, we do 1900 through 2020. And then just for the census designated places, we did a 2010 over 2020. And so we also did that for tribal areas. And then we did some mapping, and I hope to actually have some more tables as more data comes out of the decennial census. Obviously, we've only had the apportionment products come out of it and the redistricting products. Other products are set to come out later in 2020 and probably even into 2023. So keep an eye out for those releases. And then I'm going to ask to see if if Ryaneustis is on, and if he could join us and talk to us about, I'm a member of the U.S. Census Bureau State Data Center program, but Ryaneustis in Economic Development Department is the lead for the state. Ryan, are you here?
Susan, I don't see him anywhere.
You don't see him? He may be having problems logging on. So since Ryan's not here, and I'm going to double check, Norbert Nez, were you able to log in and be able to talk about the Census State Data Center program?
I don't see him either.
You don't see him? Well, I will talk a little bit about it. The U.S. Census Bureau has a whole bunch of what I would call evergreen partnerships. And one of those partnerships is the State Data Center program. This Data Users Conference is put on every year, and it's our goal within the State Data Center program to assist people accessing and using U.S. Census Bureau state data or U.S. Census Bureau data. So we put this on, and I do other trainings. And any of you have questions on census data, you'd always call and ask me, and I can help you with that. There's also what's called the Census Information Centers. It's also an Evergreen program, and those centers usually specialize in a specific population, like tribal areas or the Navajo Nation, and that would be the Census Information Center that we have in New Mexico. There's also the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, and that's done by UNM Geospatial Population Program, and that would be Robert Rodigan and Jacqueline Miller, who will be speaking later in the conference, and they do our population estimates between decennial census and our forecasts for New Mexico. There's another program called the Governor's Liaison, and we have one here in New Mexico that reports to our governor, and the Census Bureau communicates to the governor through the Governor's Liaison. And then finally, we actually also work with the data dissemination specialist and the Census Partner Specialist, and they reach out and they do presentations and provide information to the state. So I wanted you to be aware of these partnerships and that these groups of people exist in New Mexico for you to reach out to and access when you're working with census data and have questions. So I kind of went through pretty fast. I would like to turn over now and have Tom Morton share his screen. And let me just introduce a little bit about Tom. And I got to look up my little notes here. He is the Assistant Chief of the Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office at the U.S. Census Bureau. And he's going to tell you a lot more about what that Bureau does for us. Thank you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Oops. Okay. Let me just maximize this. All right. So thank you for the introduction, Susan. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. As Susan mentioned, my name is Tom. I'm the Assistant Chief of the Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. The last year and a half in particular, during the pandemic, there were a lot of updates to the program and the release of the data. And so I'm going to talk about that here today. I'm also going to talk about the different geographic products and tables included in the data. And at the top of the meeting, as Susan mentioned, we are gearing up for phase 4 of our program now, where we'll actually be collecting the congressional and state legislative district plans from the state. So I'll talk about that as well. So first and foremost, of course, we abide by Public Law 94-171, which was passed by Congress in 1975. So the Redistricting Data Program was designed to make sure that the Census Bureau could adhere to the public law. Our program mission is to provide states the opportunity to identify the different levels of geography for which demographic data, population counts are needed for the purpose of legislative and congressional redistricting, and also to deliver those data in a high quality for those areas in a timely manner. The program is conducted over a 10-year period. The 2020 program started in 2014. At the beginning of the program, we worked with the state legislative leadership and requested that they designate a staff member who could serve as the primary point of contact between the states and the Census Bureau for the duration of the program. And most importantly, that they would be a contact that would serve in a nonpartisan manner. The program from our perspective is, sorry, I pushed that forward. From our perspective is conducted in a nonpartisan manner, so it's very important that we make sure that when we work with the states, we do so in a nonpartisan manner as well. So as part of the program, we work with the states to establish the program criteria, identify the required tabulations that the states need for the purpose of redistricting. And then the goal is to deliver those tabulations to the governor and state legislative leadership 1 year from census day, no later than 1 year from census day. Of course, this cycle in particular was unique due to the pandemic, as well as the prioritization of the apportionment schedule and the release of the apportionment data. We actually delivered the redistricting data approximately 5 months later than we anticipated being able to do so. I mentioned the program was conducted over a 10-year period. It started in 2014. The first 2 phases of the program were the block boundary suggestion project and the voting district project. These first 2 phases involved working directly with the states to collect suggestions for different linear features that should be held as block boundaries for the 2020 census block universe, as well as then in phase 2, collecting the voting district plans, which are county-based, from the states, so that we could provide the 2020 census data for those areas as well. We just completed phase 3, which was the data delivery. We delivered the geographic support products last January and February. We purposely delivered those early so the states could work with those products before they received the tabulations. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those included. And then, of course, we delivered the redistricting data tabulations to the states and the public in August and September of this year. Moving on to phase 4. During phase 4, we'll collect the post-2020 census redistricting plans. So that includes the updated congressional district boundaries, as well as the redrawn state legislative district boundaries. And so we're going to reach out to all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico at the beginning of January and request that they provide their updated plans to us, which we will then incorporate into our database, our geographic database, and then we'll be producing tabulations for those geographies, both from the 2020 census and upcoming estimates releases from the American Community Survey as an example. And then phase 5 is the evaluation of the 2020 program. And we've already started conducting phase 5. We did so in July at a national conference of state legislatures meeting on the first couple of phases, and then we conducted a similar session at another conference earlier this month. And we'll continue to do that for the next couple of years. And as we close out each phase, make sure that we collect lessons learned, best practices, and recommendations from the states. We're going to take all of that information and use it to develop the design for the 2030 program. And then at the culmination of the 2020 program, we're going to release a document called the View from the States, which will provide all of the details about the evaluations and as well as the design for the 2030 program. So I want to talk a little bit about participation. We received, I think, the highest amount of participation in the first 2 phases of the program that we have in comparison to previous decades. 41 of the 52 state equivalents participated, and we received updates from just under 44% of all counties for the block boundary suggestion project. The state of New Mexico participated in both cycles of the BBSP. And then moving on to the voting district project participation, 49 of the 52 states and equivalents participated in one or more cycles of the voting district project. We received voting district plans for 3,099 counties nationwide, which is roughly 96% of all counties. Again, New Mexico participated in all three cycles, which included the initial delineation and then 2 rounds of verification. The only states that did not participate were California, Oregon, and Hawaii for differing reasons. Oregon, for example, of course, has statewide mail-in voting as an example. This slide shows a list of the geographic support products that were provided, as I mentioned, in January and February of this year. So I believe that Susan is going to share the slide deck with the attendees. There's quite a few helpful links in here about where you can go and access the data products, the tabulation, support materials, all of that stuff. So I encourage you to check out the slide deck and access the links that way. So here we've got a list of shape files, which are provided, as well as reference maps for all blocks within county, the state legislative districts and the related voting districts. You know, the maps show how the voting districts nest within the state legislative districts, census tracts, and then school districts. And then we have 3 sets of text files, the block assignment files, which provide a record for every single block and the corresponding geography in which that block nests, as well as name lookup tables to show the names and the codes provided for each level of geography, so that you can, you know, you're aware of which codes are associated with which places and stuff like that. I'll show that on the coming slide here. And then lastly, we provided the block-to-block relationship files, which crosswalk the 2010 to 2020 blocks. Each decade, the tabulation block inventory is created anew. So, you know, what could be block 1000 in 2010 might now be block 2005. It just depends on what block group it's in and what number it is. So that's why it's important that we have a crosswalk that allows folks to be able to compare the 2010 and 2020 blocks. And a couple of slides here on digging deeper into the geographic products. Here we have a list of all of the shape files that were provided as part of the geographic products. So on the left-hand side are the state-based shape files. We included like the blocks from both 2010 and 2020, the census tracts from both decades, many other levels of geography, voting districts as well as different, the 113 congressional and 116 congressional districts, just so that folks had the reference data from 2010 when they were looking at the 2020 data as well for comparison purposes. And then I know a lot of folks are interested in county-based geography. So we also provided county-based shape files with a lot of the same levels of geography so that folks at the local level could pull up data for their particular county or area of interest without having to extract it directly from the state files. And then we also provided county-based relational tables as well. And then here's some more examples. On the left-hand side here is one of our county block reference maps. And it's hard to see, I know, in the example, but within each of those blocks within the town of Yankton, South Dakota, you can see that there's a 4-digit code. And so there's also a reference to tracts on this map. And then on the right-hand side is a couple of examples of the text files. On the upper right is one of the name lookup tables. You can see in this example, we have the county subdivision FIPS codes and then the corresponding names for those. And that can be joined to the block assignment file, which has in this particular block assignment file, the county subdivision FIPS code, but it doesn't have the name. So this is a way that you can easily be able to join them and see the data, the blocks that nest within each of the places for county subdivisions. All right, let's talk now about the redistricting data tables. Again, these were provided in August and September of this year. I'm going to dig into the tables more on the next upcoming slides, but on this table, I just want to mention, on this slide, sorry, I just want to mention that a new table that was added to the suite in 2020 was table P5, which is group quarters population by group quarters type. The other 5 tables listed there were included in 2010. So this table P5 is the new table that was added. And really the reason that was added is to help states that have requirements to reallocate group quarters population to previously known addresses, so that they could have that data up front in this table. Now, we produced this table, we produced it in 2010 in summary file 1. It's table P42. So, you know, if folks are working with the data and they want to compare the group quarters population from 2020 to that of 2010, they can pull up table P42 from 2010 to do that comparison. All right. I think once I'm going to go through the next 3 slides, and then I'm going to ask Barbara if there are any questions so far in the chat. Okay, so first of all here, I want to talk about tables P1 and P3. So these tables feature 63 race iterations. There's the breakdown of the 6 races, white, that are provided in the data. White alone, Black or African American alone, American Indian and Alaska Native alone, Asian alone, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone, and then some other race alone. Okay, and then there's every combination of 2 or more races that folks can self-identify as, and that goes all the way down to a population of 6 races. Now, and so in total, there are 63 different iterations for which data are provided. So table P1 provides data for the total population. Table P3 is total population of voting age. So total population that's 18 years and over. And then moving on now to tables P2 and P4. So these contain all of the same variables. Collectively, they do. They also include Hispanic or Latino. So in both of these tables, there's a Hispanic or Latino count, and then there's a breakdown of the 63 race iterations with a count for the non-Hispanic or Latino population. And the universe for table P2 is total population. The universe for table P4 is voting age population. Moving on, rounding out the last 2 tables of the redistricting data product. Table H1 is the only housing table included in the release. So the universe is total housing units, and then there's a breakdown of occupied housing units and vacant housing units. And then table P5 is group quarters population by group quarters type. As I mentioned, this is the table that was added and is comparable to the 2010 summary file 1 table P42. The universe is total population in group quarters. There is no demographic breakdown here. It's just it's specifically a population count within different types of group quarters. And so there's a breakdown, there's the total, and then there's a breakdown of institutionalized population, which includes correctional facilities for adults and those living in nursing facilities or skilled nursing facilities, and then the non-institutionalized population, such as students in college and university housing or service members living in military quarters as examples. Oh, and right there, I'm just going to stop real quick and ask Barbara if there are any questions in the chat.
So I'm going to just speak in for 2 things. The first one is Bieber actually put a website together where we work with EDACT to put together shape files and data, and we brought in all of New Mexico's gross receipt or not gross receipts, all of New Mexico's redistricting data. So to make it easier for New Mexicans to download that data. And then I have a question. So I know that there was a lot of discussion as the pandemic hit and all of our schools shut down, and a lot of them sent students back home. How did that look in that P6 table?
And okay, so yes, I'm happy to answer that question. So there's a couple of parts there. We reached out in June of 2020. We reached out to the administrations and the presidents of many universities across the country. I don't have an exact list, but I think there were over 10,000 group quarters, which many of them were universities. And I believe we had collected data on those students that should have been living on campus as of April 1st, but of course had moved home. But then there was also a big concern about the students that are living off campus that were in, maybe like regular housing units, not necessarily group quarters, but that would have been living close to campus as of April 1st that had either moved back home or gone somewhere else to work or do whatever. And so we reached out and requested that information from the universities as well. And then if in the chance that maybe back home their parents had filled out the census and included them because they were living there at that time, we would have had a way to unduplicate those responses so that that person would have been counted at the university as opposed to being counted at a housing unit, in their hometown or wherever. So that's one part of it. However, that's a good question because just 2 weeks ago, we announced via the Federal Register that we're going to conduct a post-census group quarters review on a similar timeline as our count question resolution program, which I'll talk about later on in the presentation here. And that, it's hard to, the acronym, because we have a lot of acronyms, PCGQR is going to have a similar timeline. And it's going to allow eligible entities to appeal their group quarters population counts if they feel that they were not accurately or correctly reflected in what was provided in the release. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
So Tom,
Yeah, go ahead.
To answer your question, no, there are no questions in chat and there are no hands raised.
Okay, sounds good. And no pressure, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So if you guys, I'm going to continue on through the rest of the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end here. So thank you, Susan, for those questions. And so now I want to talk about the format. As Susan mentioned, there's a way that the state of New Mexico and BBER has put together an easy way to download or access and download the redistricting data. And we also have a few ways on our site. So back in August, of course, we released the legacy format summary files. And I want to mention that even though we have multiple formats, the data values are the same regardless of the format. That's a question that we've received quite a bit, and we want to make sure that it's clear that that is indeed the case. But the legacy files are the full redistricting data summary files, so folks can access and download them and save them locally. It's the quickest way on our end for folks to be able to do that. They do require additional handling, and because of that, we have support materials available on our website to help data users work with the legacy files. And I'll talk a little bit about those on the coming slides. And then our user-friendly data dissemination version is via data.census.gov. And I look at the agenda for the conference, and so on Wednesday at 1 p.m., Kaneen Reese from the Census Bureau will be conducting a demonstration of how to access the redistricting data on that site. So be sure to tune into that if you get a chance. Data.census.gov allows for custom filtering to be able to view, map, and download the data of interest. So you can go and select a level of geography. You can select the year that you're interested in, and you can select the type of survey you're interested in. And there's a couple of screenshots on the right-hand side about what that looks like. And then Susan mentioned upcoming data releases from the 2020 census. All of those releases will be published to the data.census.gov platform as well. So if you haven't used it before, I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with that because it's going to be helpful for future data releases. And then, of course, for the programming folks that work with API, we do have an API call that's been set up featuring the data. If you are a new user, just make sure to sign up, and there's a link to sign up for a key included here. And we also have example calls provided on the census website that you can work with. And then to talk a little bit about the support materials, also there's a link here to where these are available. On our website is the 2020 Census Redistricting Data Technical Documentation, which covers all of the geographic and subject matter content provided in the redistricting data. We also have a header file in Excel format. It's sort of like metadata because it provides each of the fields or variables and then descriptions of those to help with explaining and understanding the data. And then we have a Microsoft Access database shell that the legacy files can be loaded into, as well as SAS and R scripts. So all of those materials are available on our site. A couple of other things I want to talk about. Folks may get questions, from local governments or counties about, the highest level data that's available in terms of like total population. And we have a website called QuickFacts, or the QuickFacts application, which has been around for quite a long time, at least going back to the 2010 census. And so in here, you can easily look up that information and compare it for up to 6 geographic entities at a time. So you can see here, I'm comparing state, nation, county, and a couple of incorporated places in the state of New Mexico as an example. We also have a demographic data map viewer, and this features the redistricting data for states, counties, and census tracts. The geographies are scale dependent, so as you zoom into a larger, more detailed scale, you'll see the tracts populate, or the counties populate, and then the tracts populate. And this is a nice tool because we've got, in addition to like Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino data, we have data on race alone. There's also data on population density and population change from 2010 to 2020, which is really nice for viewing quickly, especially when you drill down to the tract level. Get a good sense of where the population changes are at a sub-county level. There's a link to this tool as well on the slide. A couple of other items. We have Tableau data visualizations available on our site. I'll go through these pretty quickly. You can compare, the percentage of population. You can look at the percentage of population age 18 and older by state or under 18. Here in the state of New Mexico, you can see, for example, you can drill down and see data at the county level for population 18 and older and under 18, as well as do some comparison or look up facts for different counties and different states. So, this is, of course, a trend nationwide, but you can see here for like Valencia County, for example, the total population declined slightly from 2010 to 2020. But if you look at the age 18 and older voting age population, that increased by 3.1% in the county, whereas the under 18 population decreased by 10.5%. So that, that tells us a similar story that we're seeing across the country, that the population is aging, and in terms of voting and voting age population, it's increasing. So So anyway, something to keep in mind. We also have data available down to the track level for the diversity index calculation. And then we have data for race and ethnicity, this visualization where you can select a different group, race group, and then different characteristics for that race group. And again, that's available all the way down to the county level. And then we have the state profiles and a link to how to access that. So you can go there and access the profile specifically for New Mexico, and you'd have direct links to all of these visualizations. Also, I want to encourage you to check out our website, which is census.gov/RDO. And on our website, you can access the summary files and the support materials. There's also accordion menus at the bottom of the landing page that include everything related to redistricting. So there's links to data.census.gov, different data tools, the visualizations I've talked about. There's links to blog posts related to redistricting, as well as press releases, all of that information. So I definitely encourage you to check our site out. Now I want to focus, so I'm kind of talked about where we've been in terms of the 2020 census data. And now there's a couple of other slides here I want to talk about real quick. Susan mentioned at the top of the presentation about upcoming census data product releases. And although we don't have specific months or dates or months at this time, we are planning to release the demographic profile and the demographic and housing characteristics file in 2022. So focusing on the demographic profile, this product will provide selected demographic and housing characteristics about local communities, including age cohorts, 5-year age cohorts, data on sex, race, and Hispanic or Latino origin, as well as additional demographics on group quarters population and housing occupancy and tenure. And then we plan to release the demographic and housing characteristics file as well in 22. A lot of the variables included in this file were previously included in the 2010 Census Summary File 1. So you may recall in 2000 and 2010, we talked a lot about, or we referred to Summary File 1 and Summary File 2. Those names are going away for more descriptive names of what's included actually in the data set. So what we used to call Summary File 1 is now, for the most part, demographic and housing characteristics. The last item here is detailed demographic and housing characteristics, or detailed DHC for short. This product actually will combine many of the statistics or variables that were released as part of Summary File 2 from the 2010 census, as well as the American Indian and Alaska Native Summary File. So as an example, the product provides pop counts and demographic and housing statistics for detailed racial and ethnic groups, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and village groups. So like this is where you're going to get the information, like if you're looking at information like for Asian groups as an example, Vietnamese population versus Chinese population, those types of characteristics are provided, will be provided in this data set. Okay. And then I want to talk, I mentioned talked a little bit about the post-census group quarters review. Here on this slide, I'm talking about the count question resolution program. I'm sure many of you have probably received some questions or concerns from tribal, county, and local governments about their population counts for different areas. And so the purpose of the 2020 program is to provide a way for the governmental units to request a review of their official 2020 census results, with the goal is to help ensure that the population and housing units are correctly allocated to each of the tabulation blocks in the 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico. So in just a couple of weeks, around mid-December, the Census Bureau is going to send a notification to all of the eligible tribal, state, county, local governments that are eligible to participate, which, you know, is pretty much all of them. I think when they talk about eligibility, it's like a local government, like an incorporated place versus a CDP, which of course a CDP wouldn't be eligible because it's not a functioning government, you know, just as an example. And then folks will have the opportunity to start filing CQR cases in January of 22. So coming up in just over a month. And they'll be able to submit those appeals or those cases through June 30th of 2023. And the Census Bureau will provide feedback by no later than September 30th of 23. But I want to point out that really the response is first come, first serve, and it's based on when we receive the appeal or the CQR case. So the goal there is, you know, that we want to the Census Bureau wants to provide feedback within 90 days of receipt of the case, if that makes sense. So somebody submitting the case in January will probably hear back on that, you know, at sometime like April, by the end of April or something like that. And there's a link here to the Federal Register notice as well that was recently published in October. I don't have a link on this slide for the Federal Register notice for the post-census group quarters review, but I can definitely share that in the chat so that everybody has access to that after I get done with the presentation here. Just to give you an idea about what different CQR cases look like. So there's 3 examples here. On the upper left-hand side of the slide, we've got a situation where this block, which is 2001, which is in white right here, let's say that's part of an incorporated place. And you can see here that, and let's say that this other block, 2000, is part of another jurisdiction, maybe a county subdivision or some other incorporated place. And you can see here that there were 3 housing units on the right-hand side of the street that were mistakenly allocated to the left side. And so in this particular instance, the entity on the right may have filed the case, or the county could have filed it. And these 3 housing units were reallocated to the appropriate side of the street. So this is considered a geocoding correction example. On the upper right, we have a coverage correction example. In this case, there are housing units that are missing from the count, right? So the entity can file an appeal and say that you missed these housing units, and then during our review, we could make the determination that yes, in fact, we did miss them, and we would add them in right here. The third example here is a boundary case correction. This would be a situation where perhaps we had the incorporated place boundary incorrectly delineated, and therefore the housing units that are on the right side of the street should have actually been included in the incorporated place, but they weren't because the boundary was out of date. Now, one point of clarification there, the boundaries that were used to tabulate the 2020 census data are based on, the data tabulations are based on the census or the incorporated place boundaries and other geographic boundaries as of January 1st, 2020. So if there was an annexation after that point, of course, if you compare that latest version with the latest annexation, it's not going to match up, but we can't make updates after that are effective after January 1st. that makes sense, of 2020. So those are 3 different scenarios for where a CQR case that's submitted could be, we could accept changes as examples. And I think that's pretty much all I have here. Here's some contact information for me. Again, we're very happy to answer any questions any folks have. Our email address is rdo@census.gov, and we have a phone number as well that we check regularly, and of course our website. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Barbara and Susan and see if there are any questions.
So I actually
oh,
go ahead.
There's been a question in chat. It's kind of been answered, but let me pose it to you also. I'm curious if our guest has seen any particular good examples of how different states and regions have used this data to support economic development. And then further goes on, not sure if there is, just looking for other best practices. Now, Susan answered it with, this data is more for redistricting, but it gives basic characteristics of the population. And then Susan further answered it with, I'm thinking that this would be best for pulse survey and the economic census presentation. So I'm giving it to you to see if you have anything.
So that's a very good question, and I think that Susan's answer is on par exactly what I would have said. That this data is, I guess, somewhat basic in terms of using it for economic analysis. It's more specific to redistricting, and Andy Height from the Econ Directorate will be presenting in another session, I believe tomorrow.
I think it's Thursday.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Susan. Thursday, and he would be able to better answer that. I think for economic analysis, my guess is you'd probably need data on income, on educational attainment, those types of things probably as well. And those would be, there's data in the American Community Survey, 5-year estimates, 1 and 5-year estimates that provides that type of detail as well. So that's in addition to what Andy will probably speak about in regards to the economic census.
Okay, but Tom, let me ask this. In regards to the pulse survey and the resilience, is the 2010 data being used, or is 2020 data the 2020 POP data being used?
So the pulse survey, and sorry, what's the other one?
Resilience. There's a resilience survey coming back.
Okay, I can look at that. My understanding is that it would be based on earlier than 2020 census data, because the only releases, as Susan mentioned as well, the only releases that are feature 2020 data so far are the apportionment counts and the redistricting data, and then any surveys or anything related to that would not have factored in the 2020 data yet, right? So, but I can look more into the pulse survey and resilience survey and see specifically what sources are used to develop those data sets.
That would be great, because I can't even answer. I would have to refer back to that SME. So I just thought maybe you might know, but thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately I do not.
Well, that's 2 of us from the Bureau that don't know, so we'll find out.
Thank you very much. And then I believe, Susan, you may have had a question or 2.
Always. So the first thing is, remember to put the link to the Federal Register for the group quarters in chat for us. I think I've seen it, but there are a couple people I know who need to see it. And then a lot of you, probably the first time you've ever seen the CQR program. And my question to you is that when I looked at the quality control data All right, so the Census Bureau released information on the non-response follow-up and the quality of that response. There are a couple areas in New Mexico where I noted that housing units were closed pretty fast and didn't actually get all 6 knocks on the door, or and I know this is the case that there are some areas in New Mexico that get the census data, the update leave program only because they have nothing but PO boxes in those counties, and that program was interrupted. So for those people where that may be the case, is there, if we look at that data, would that be another way that they could ask for the Census Bureau to review the count because of the way the survey played out during the pandemic in those areas? Does that make sense?
It does. It's a good question, and it makes sense. So the way that CQR works, it's specific to really areas with the housing unit count, right? So if somebody makes if there's a situation where a local government feels that because update leave was closed out earlier, or non-response follow-up may have not been adequate, still the way to file an appeal is to do so based on the housing units. From the Census Bureau's perspective, in the state of New Mexico and in a total of 49 of the 50 states, the enumeration, or 99.9% of households would have been enumerated. As far as the some of the folks in non-response follow-up not getting 6 knocks, there are some other reasons for that. There was the use of administrative records in some cases. The Census Bureau may have determined that the address was vacant. We may have conducted proxy interviews with neighbors. At a certain point, if we haven't received a response after so many visits, there's the option to conduct a proxy interview. So there are other ways that we are able to collect that data in those cases where we cannot get somebody to answer the door, if that makes sense.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you. I appreciate your taking the time and presenting to our audience here in New Mexico. We have another question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
All right.
There we go. Hi. Thanks so much for this info. I'm curious, how many count questions do you typically need to resolve around the country, and how many roughly you might anticipate from New Mexico?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. It's so I could look back at the 2010 assessment, because I think that would probably give us the details about how many some appeals there were, how many were approved, etc. But so a breakdown by the state of New Mexico, I'm not sure I can provide that. But the best I can do is provide a link to the 2010 assessment report for the 2010 CQR program, and that's where we can get that information.
And I'll back home on this one. There, at one of the presentations, Matthew Fratis is the branch chief for count question resolution. And I believe there was around 1,300 cases in 2010 that were resolved. That's not to say how many actually came in without, the correct documentation, etc. But Matthew would be the one that we could get that answer for and get out to everyone. I'll get it to you, Susan.
Perfect. I'm just going to say, I think I pulled down data, and there's about a half dozen areas in New Mexico that had revised data after the 2010 census. So that, Nancy, might give you an anticipation of between, a dozen and a half dozen that we might see. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, when you're in the data and there's an errata attached to it, that means that there was some kind of change, and that's where you could go in and look and see if it was a count question or if it was an error that we found that was not brought to our attention by an outside source.
Yes, and as a heads up, I just posted the link to the post-census group quarters review Federal Register notice. That was published 10 days ago on 11/19, and that was determined. That determination was made. You know, there were some concerns reported to us, and so of course the Census Bureau wants to do whatever we can to ensure that the jurisdictions have the correct POP counts, both for housing units and group quarters. And, you know, that's why we're conducting this group quarters program in addition to the count question resolution program. So yeah, and there's still some details to be worked out there, but generally speaking, the program will be conducted along the same timeline as the CQR program. So folks would have till the end of January of 23 to submit their group quarters review appeals.
Thank you. This is great. And I think I see some thanks in the comment section. It's, you know, I think redistricting is something we all hear about and we know about, but you don't really understand the details until you have the decennial census come around.
Yeah, that's a good point. And thank you so much, Susan, for having me. I'm gonna look at the CQR numbers for 2010, or at least the assessment. And are you guys going to use the same session later on today? Because I can copy and paste the link in here too.
Yes, we are.
You are? Okay. Then I'll paste the link in this session.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Tom. So what I'm going to note here, I've shared my session. This concludes our welcome and intro and the start of our conference for this year. And thank you all for coming in for this session. The next session will be the New Mexico Economy, Recent History and Outlook by Michael O'Donnell. And we'll start that at 1 o'clock. But this session will be here. So those of you who want to hang out and ask questions, I'll be here on and off, as I probably have to take a run to the restroom or something, but I plan to be around. So we have one more question. I'm curious what the current census data shows our supposed brain drain and what percentage of our youth are leaving the state. When I researched U.S. Census data a few years ago, I found that the percentage of young people leaving the state was less than the national average leaving other states, so that these concerns were overstated. That's a good question, Stacy. And I know that we've got here at Bieber, we recently might have pulled some data on that. The data is going to be from 2019 still, because we haven't had the release of the American Community Survey 2020 data to look at that. We usually pull down the microdata, the PUMS data, to look at migration statistics. And I understand 1-year estimates are supposed to come out tomorrow. And then the 5-year estimates have been delayed till March of next year. So we won't see the 2020 data till later. I'll see what I can find for you, Stacy, on the migration data. Cool.
Susan,
hey, Robert.
I'm gonna shut the record off.
Go ahead. Hey, Robert, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Susan. Thanks, Thomas and Barbara. Just because there's so much interest in the CQ